The Nestorian controversy is essentially centered around the language used to describe both the nature and the divinity of Christ. A major conflict came around the word Theotokos, which had to do with the relationship Mary had to the divine birth. So Theotokos means mother of God, and then people like Nestorius had a big problem with that, saying that God couldn't be born of a woman, and that became a big problem and a big issue in the church, and a big theological debate essentially ensued because of this issue of language.
So the Nestorian controversy was essentially the theological battles of Nestorius and Cyril, and even though these were strictly theological, they were also political because they were both bishops in two major cities of theological studies. So in a sense, they were trying to prove themselves to be higher and have higher understanding over one another, and if they saw that one person or any other person with different ideology that didn't fit into theirs, they would try to basically push them aside and advocate themselves.
So during this time, there was a very large overlap over the imperial lawmakers and religious leaders. So you have religious leaders very much in public relations and doing all sorts of, they were very involved in the politics. And the lawmakers would try and impose certain laws in order to maintain religious harmony amongst the people. And so as a result, it became very confusing. But also during this time, Christianity was very rampant and very popular. But there was still more questions to answer. And then even with that, there's the fact that the other thing is bishops were in charge. They were like the super pastor, so to speak, of each of their areas. And so when you had someone like Nestorius, who was trying to tell everybody how, or critiquing everybody on vocabulary to be used, he was kind of encroaching on other people's territory.
Because Nestorius was the advocate of Jesus Christ's human nature, meaning that he didn't really believe in the Trinity doctrine in a sense, because the definition he saw there was a flaw, because he had a sense that the doctrine of Trinity advocated a full divinity and not a human nature in Jesus Christ. So one interesting thing that I researched was they used a word called Theotokos, which was the word for Mary, meaning God-bearer. And Nestorius didn't particularly like this title because, like I said before, this denoted that Christ had no human nature. So Nestorius' whole issue and theological beliefs was basically centered on the duality of Christ's nature, meaning there was human and divine nature in one being. And Nestorius says something about how Jesus Christ being born from Mary was basically his body that came out of Mary was a vessel for the Logos to be instilled in. And essentially that proves his point, or helps emphasize the point that there is a duality in every sense and does not contradict the doctrine of Trinity. So that's how he inputted his theological aspect into this whole paradigm of trying to understand God.
One of the things I found very interesting is there was two main schools of thought during this time. Speaking theologically, there was the Alexandria school of Alexandrian, and then Antioch. And Theodosius, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at the time, favored the way, Antioch's way of thinking of things. And so through that, Nestorius found favor and was appointed bishop, and as a result, a patriarch, just because it was such a central location. But at the Council of Constantinople, when everything just went downhill for Nestorius, he didn't show up until later on, and so Cyril was able to turn Theodosius and other very influential people against Nestorius during this time, so that by the time he was able to show up, no one was really on his side. No one liked him, so he was exiled.
So Cyril was on the other side of this belief about Jesus Christ's incarnation. He believed that there was only one nature in Jesus Christ, which he described using the word homeostasis, which is the two natures synthesizing strictly as being one. So because Cyril believed in that, he saw Nestorius' comment of the duality of nature being in one body as highly controversial, and he felt as if Nestorius was breaking the unity of the church. And basically Cyril wanted to advocate that there is nothing wrong saying that Christ was fully divine. He wasn't denouncing the human characteristic of Jesus Christ, but he was saying basically the divine aspect of Jesus Christ is on a higher pedestal in a sense. That is why he could accomplish all that he did while he was here.
So Cyril was the bishop of Alexandria, and Alexandria was also a major region in the Eastern Roman Empire, so he also was a patriarch for that general area.
Cyril was a bishop from Alexandria who came from an upper class family, so he had an upbringing in the sense of he got privileges of things like education and was highly instructed in things like rhetoric, which was really important in Roman culture for a person of influence. So he knew how to talk, and he was well equipped to be a speaker in. An important social reality to note is the fact that Alexandria and Antioch were these very large port cities that were kind of the hub of commerce in a sense. So there was a really large audience that kind of got to witness what was going on within the Nestorian controversy. So not only was Christianity growing, but the population in general was growing. So you can imagine there was this sense of kind of urgency to have kind of like a unified idea and unified central agreement on the nature of Christ and this big issue, because there's so many people watching, and so you can imagine there's a lot of tension and pressure to have this kind of unified idea going on.
Okay, so you have three major regions. You have Antioch and Constantinople and Alexandria. They were all very central theological centers during the early church. But Antioch and Alexandria were at war basically with each other. And so you have Cyril of Alexandria and Nestorius of Antioch not only had a theological view, but it was also very personal, just in the sense that both wanted to be the theological center.
In a sense, Roman trade and commerce is comparable to our modern day economy, because they were such a culture that was focused on consumer goods. In the United States today, we kind of have this consumer mentality, so I think it's an interesting thing to note kind of some of the similarities we have between ancient Rome and kind of our modern day luxury and just in terms of lifestyle, because typically Romans were pretty well off, and so I think it's just sort of an interesting similarity we can draw between the ancient world and today's
So
world.
during this time, you had three major areas and like central locations for theological, religious, and even economic influence. And so you had Constantinople, of course, which was the new Rome, and then you had Alexandria, which had for a long time been that central location, and then you had Antioch as well, who sought to kind of displace Constantinople. And but between Alexandria and Antioch, there had just been this ongoing strife and like upset between religious leaders between the two, and just as a result there was a lot of personal vendettas, and so they didn't want to just displace each other theologically but personally as well. During this time, I think there are two main things to note when considering the geopolitical realities of the Nestorian conflict. The first is just considering the foundation. Shortly before this, the Theodosian Code had been established, and there was still laws like being added onto it until it was published later on. But why that's important is because it really set the tone and like boundaries in which to conduct religious activities. There was just such an overlap of you have the imperial and like the state officials, and then you had bishops of the church. And the bishops of the church obviously considered themselves like the final say-so over, you know, the Christians, but the lawmakers considered themselves the ones that had to establish religious harmony amongst everybody. And so with that said, there was just this overlap, and it made it very confusing at times when, like, even with the councils at like Constantinople and Ephesus, they would finally establish a final say-so theology. I think in the essence of Christianity, we should seek unity. I think a lot of times, even with like personal agendas and such, there's been division, and that's not really what Christ wanted to begin with. And so a lot of times, instead of fighting over twigs and branches, we should seek to know what we do agree on. And a lot of times just appreciate the mystery, and that we won't always fully understand Christ.
We can learn that there's usually a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to certain disagreements. There are political agendas and kind of these social stigmas behind what's going on. So the issue, in a sense, isn't always the issue. Though this was an important theological discussion to be had, there were hidden agendas, and there were kind of toes being stepped on in like a personal sense. So I think we can learn that there's always kind of more than meets the eye when it comes to studying history, and even when we take that into our modern context, there's usually more to a conflict than just what's on the